Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, find the softest blanket in the house, and be very, very grateful that we don't live in the year 1050. We're going to talk about the absolute logistical nightmare of staying warm in a medieval castle before the invention of the actual fireplace. It's a story of damp stone, questionable fashion choices, and the realization that being a duke mostly just meant you were the coldest person in the room with the fanciest hat. So, settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let's talk about the shivering nobility. To understand how people kept warm, we first have to understand the castle itself. Imagine, if you will, a giant hollow tooth made of damp limestone. That's your home. There are no windows, just slits for archers, because apparently the only thing worse than freezing to death was being shot by a crossbow. Before the 12th century, the fireplace as we know it, built into the wall with a chimney, didn't really exist. Instead, you had a central hearth. This was basically a glorified campfire in the middle of the great hall. The smoke would just wander. It would drift up toward a hole in the roof called a louver, but mostly it just hung around the ceiling, turning everyone's expensive tapestries into soot-covered rags. If you were a king, you sat closest to the fire, which meant your front was toasted while your back remained at a crisp 38 degrees, because why not have the best of both worlds? To combat this, the nobility didn't just wear clothes, they wore architectural layers. You'd have your linen chemise, followed by a wool tunic, followed by another wool tunic, and then the pièce de résistance, the surcoat, lined with fur. This is where we get into the weirdly specific hierarchy of dead animals. If you were truly important, you wore ermine, those tiny white weasels with the black-tipped tails. If you were just a minor local lord who was bad with money, you settled for squirrel or rabbit. You were essentially a human onion, peeling back layers of rodent skins just to go to bed. Speaking of beds, that's where the real engineering happened. The four-poster bed wasn't a design choice for aesthetics, it was a survival pod. You had heavy wool curtains that you would tie shut, trapping your own body heat and carbon dioxide inside a tiny fabric box. It was cozy in a I might wake up with a headache from lack of oxygen kind of way. Some royals even had footboys, which sounds prestigious until you realize their entire job was to sleep at the foot of the bed like a human space heater, because nothing says divine right to rule like using a teenager as a thermal blanket. Let's float over to the walls themselves. You've seen those massive, intricate tapestries in museums, right? Usually depicting a unicorn being harassed or a very stiff-looking hunt. Those weren't just for decoration. They were the medieval version of pink fiberglass insulation. Stone walls sweat when the temperature changes, and a bare stone wall is basically a giant ice cube. By hanging massive sheets of wool an inch or two away from the stone, you created a tiny pocket of dead air. It didn't make the room warm exactly, but it stopped the wall from actively sucking the soul out of your body when you walked past it. Of course, the servants didn't have tapestries. They had rushed floors. This was a thick layer of dried reeds and straw spread across the ground. It provided a tiny bit of insulation for your feet, but it also acted as a giant, permanent biological filter for everything that dropped: stray bits of mutton, spilled ale, and the occasional dog. It was soft, it was warmish, and it was probably the most terrifying thing you could ever drop a candle on. The art of not freezing to death. So, we've established that the Great Hall was essentially a smoky refrigerator. But as we move into the late 12th century, around the 1170s, things started to get a bit experimental. The nobility decided that smelling like a campfire 24/7 was perhaps not the peak of sophisticated living. Enter the wall fireplace. Now, you'd think this would be a simple fix, but in the medieval world, nothing is ever simple. The first chimneys were basically just holes poked diagonally through the wall. If the wind blew the wrong way, the smoke didn't go out, it just took a U-turn and blew right back into the Baron's face. Because why have a clear view of your dinner when you can have a stinging sensation in your eyes instead? But let's glide over to the more personal ways people stayed warm, because when the architecture fails you, you have to get creative. This brings us to the delightful world of the chaufferette. If you were a noblewoman sitting in a drafty solar, which was the private room that was still somehow always freezing, you couldn't exactly carry the hearth with you. Instead, you had a little metal cage or a ceramic box filled with hot coals. You'd tuck it under your voluminous skirts and hope for the best. It was essentially a portable lap oven. It kept your knees warm, sure, but it also carried the very real risk of setting your extremely expensive silk dress on fire. It was a high-stakes game of thermal comfort. And then there were the hot bricks. If you were a monk or a scholar, you spent a lot of time sitting still in stone rooms that felt like tombs. The solution? You'd heat a brick in the kitchen fire, wrap it in a piece of old wool, and put it under your feet. It provided about 20 minutes of bliss, followed by 2 hours of lukewarm disappointment. But in 1170, lukewarm was a luxury. Let's talk about the hygiene of warmth, or rather, the lack of it. There's a persistent myth that medieval people never washed because they were dirty. In reality, they didn't wash because it was terrifyingly cold. Imagine stripping down in a room where you can see your own breath to climb into a wooden tub of water that was heated over a fire 3 hours ago and is now the temperature of a mountain stream. Of course, they preferred to just layer on more fur. If you haven't seen your own skin since October, are you really even dirty? It was a philosophy of out of sight, out of mind, supplemented by a very heavy application of rose water and prayer. As we move deeper into the castle, we find the garderobe or the latrine. Now usually, this was just a hole in a stone closet that dropped straight down into a moat. It was, arguably, the coldest place in the entire kingdom. There are accounts of royals having the stone seat covered in fabric or fur, because sitting on bare limestone in January is a spiritual experience no one asked for. Some even kept their clothes hanging in the garderobe because the ammonia from the waste actually killed the moths and fleas, so your clothes were warmish, moth-free, and smelled faintly of a stable, a triple win for the medieval elite. Let's float over to the concept of social heating. In the Middle Ages, privacy was a concept for the poor. The rich were never alone. If you were a king or a queen, your bedchamber was constantly filled with ladies-in-waiting, squires, and guards. This wasn't just for service, it was for the BTUs. Having 10 extra humans sleeping on pallets on the floor of your bedroom raised the ambient temperature by a few crucial degrees. You weren't just a ruler, you were a thermostat. The more important you were, the more people were packed into your room, and thus, the warmer you slept. It's a very cozy, very crowded, and very smelly way to survive the Little Ice Age. And we can't forget the dogs. The lap dog wasn't originally a fashion accessory. It was a biological hot water bottle. Breeds like the Cavalier King Charles or various small spaniels were specifically bred to sit on the laps of noblewomen to keep the blood flowing to their extremities. They were portable, self-heating, and occasionally barked at ghosts. If you were a duke, you might have a couple of massive greyhounds sleeping across your feet. It was a functional ecosystem of fur and snoring. Because why settle for one heating method when you could use all of them? You're wearing 4 layers of wool, sitting on a fur-lined chair with a dog on your feet, a hot brick under your stool, and a tapestry behind you, all while a servant tries to convince a smoky fire to actually move up a chimney. It was an exhausting amount of work just to reach a temperature we would today describe as uncomfortably chilly. As the night wears on, imagine the silence of a castle in midwinter. The only sound is the crackle of the dying fire and the occasional rustle of a tapestry in the draft. Everyone is tucked away in their fabric pods, huddling together, waiting for a sun that won't really provide any warmth for another 5 months. It makes you appreciate your central heating, doesn't it? Just a little bit.
The peasant's winter and the frozen Thames.
So we've spent quite a bit of time shivering with the dukes and duchesses in their drafty stone towers. But let's float down the social ladder for a moment, past the velvet and the ermine, to the people who actually did the work. If you were a medieval peasant, your house wasn't made of limestone. It was made of wattle and daub, which, for the uninitiated, is basically sticks held together by mud and cow dung. Surprisingly, this was actually warmer than a castle. Mud and straw are fantastic insulators. While the king was freezing in his giant hollow stone tooth, the peasants were essentially huddling inside a giant dried-out clod of earth. Of course, you had to share that space with your cow, your pigs, and about 6 of your closest relatives. It was cramped, it smelled like a wet barn, and the ventilation was just the gaps in the thatch, but at least the cow was putting out a steady 101 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1170, a cow was basically a 1,500-pound space heater that also provided milk. Talk about a multifunctional appliance. But let's talk about what happened when the weather got really weird. Every few decades, Europe would enter what historians call a little ice age, and things would get so cold that the River Thames in London would freeze solid. Now, for any normal person, a frozen river is a sign of a climate disaster. But for the people of the past, it was an excuse for a party. Because why not? If you can't grow crops and you're already freezing, you might as well go out onto the ice and set up a frost fair. Imagine a whole city of tents and stalls built right on top of the river. They would roast entire oxen over open fires built directly on the ice. Think about the physics of that for a second. You are standing on a frozen river, cooking a massive animal over a bonfire and hoping the ice doesn't realize it's supposed to be melting. It was the ultimate doubling down on bad weather. They had bowling, dancing, and even printed commemorative tickets on the ice to prove they had survived the Great Frost. It was the medieval equivalent of a "I survived a blizzard" t-shirt, but with more chance of drowning in freezing slush. Let's drift back to the indoor life of the commoner. While the rich had their fur-lined robes, the poor had boiled wool. If you boil wool, it shrinks and becomes incredibly dense and water-resistant. It's stiff, it's itchy, and it smells like a wet dog when it rains, but it keeps the wind out. A peasant in a thick woolen hood was often more thermally stable than a princess in a silk gown shivering behind a tapestry. And then there were the beds. We talked about the 4-poster survival pods of the rich, but the poor had the box bed. It was literally a wooden cupboard with doors. You climbed in, pulled the doors shut, and slept in a tiny, airless wooden box. It kept your body heat in perfectly. It also meant that if a fire broke out, which, given the thatched roofs and central hearths, happened about every Tuesday, you were essentially pre-packaged for the afterlife. But hey, at least you died warm. The transitions between seasons were the hardest. In early spring, the dampness would settle into your bones. This is why medieval medicine was so obsessed with humors. If you were cold and wet, you were phlegmatic. The cure? Usually something spicy or a hot herbal poultice. They would take mustard seeds or horseradish, grind them into a paste, and smear it on your chest. It would burn your skin slightly, creating a sensation of heat. It didn't actually raise your core temperature, but your brain was too busy screaming about the mustard burn to notice that your toes were turning blue. It was gaslighting for your nervous system. Let's float over to the concept of the fire dog. In the Great Hall, these were heavy iron stands that held the logs up so air could circulate. But as we moved toward the late medieval period, they became decorative. They had faces, claws, and family crests. It's funny, really. Humans were so desperate for warmth that we started personifying the tools that held the fire. We turned our heating equipment into pets. As we close our eyes and imagine the flickering orange light of a dying hearth, let's think about the sheer resilience of these people. No electricity, no insulation, just wool, wood, and the sheer stubbornness to survive another winter.
They lived in a world that was perpetually dim and perpetually chilly, yet they still found the energy to build cathedrals and hold festivals on frozen rivers.
The curfew and the constant threat of combustion. So, we've made it through the night in our wooden box beds and our fur-lined survival pods. But there's a reason why medieval people were so obsessed with controlling the fire. And it wasn't just because they liked rules. It's because their entire world was basically a giant tinderbox waiting for a single stray spark to end the whole show. Enter the curfew. Now, today, a curfew is just something your parents give you when you're 16 to make sure you're not out making questionable life choices. But the word actually comes from the French couvre-le-feu, which literally translates to cover fire. Around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., the town bell would ring, and that wasn't just a signal to go to sleep. It was a legal mandate to bank your hearth and cover your fire with a metal lid. Because, let's be honest, when your house is made of dried mud, straw, and wood, having an open flame while you're unconscious is a bold strategy. If your neighbor's house caught fire, your house caught fire, and then the whole street caught fire. There were no fire trucks, just a few guys with leather buckets and a very optimistic attitude toward physics. So the curfew was the medieval version of a smoke detector, except instead of a beeping sound, you got a heavy fine from the local bailiff if he saw a glow coming from your window. Let's float over to the fire pans and chafing dishes. These were the high-tech gadgets of the 1300s. If you were a scholar trying to write a manuscript in a scriptorium, you couldn't have a giant bonfire next to your expensive parchment. Instead, you had a small charcoal brazier. It was a metal stand that held glowing coals. It didn't warm the room, but it kept your ink from freezing. Yes, ink used to freeze. Imagine trying to write the history of the world and having to stop because your pen turned into an icicle. It really puts our slow Wi-Fi complaints into perspective, doesn't it? Then there was the warming pan. This is one of my favorite pieces of historical nonsense. It was a long-handled metal pan, usually made of brass, that you'd fill with hot coals from the main fire. A servant would then slide it back and forth between your linen sheets before you climbed in. It was wonderful, except for the fact that if the lid wasn't closed tightly, you'd end up with a bed full of ash and a very scorched mattress. It was basically a game of, how much do I trust the laundry maid not to set my bedroom on fire tonight? But let's talk about the psychological toll of the cold. When you live in a world where the sun goes down at 4 p.m. and you're legally required to cover your fire by 8 p.m., you spend a lot of time in the dark. This is why the winter solstice and Christmas became such massive multi-day benders. The Yule log wasn't just a cute tradition, it was a logistical necessity. You'd find the biggest, gnarliest log you could find, something that could burn for 12 days straight, and you'd haul it into the Great Hall. The goal was to never let the light go out, because in the medieval mind, the dark wasn't just cold, it was populated. It was full of spirits, fairies, and whatever else was lurking in the damp shadows behind the tapestries. Fire wasn't just heat, it was a spiritual barrier. It was the only thing standing between you and the crushing, freezing void of a northern winter. And speaking of the void, let's consider the warming rooms in monasteries, known as the calefactory. For monks who spent their days in silence and prayer in unheated stone cathedrals, the calefactory was the only room in the entire monastery where you could actually feel your fingers. Can you imagine the sheer intensity of 30 monks sitting in total silence, just staring at a hearth, soaking up every single calorie of heat before heading back out to chant in a room that was basically a meat locker? It was the highlight of their day. As we drift toward the end of our journey through the cold, take a second to feel the weight of your own duvet. Think about the fact that you can turn a dial and make the air around you exactly 72 degrees. To a medieval king, that would seem like literal sorcery.
He had the crown, the land, and the army, but he'd probably trade a small castle just for a pair of your wool socks and a modern space heater. The history of keeping warm isn't just a history of technology, it's a history of human stubbornness. We refused to let the climate dictate where we lived. We built stone towers in the wind. We wore weasels on our necks, and we slept in wooden cupboards, all just to prove a point to the winter. And as the embers in our imaginary hearth fade to gray, we can finally close our eyes, knowing that the couvre-feu has rung, the fire is banked, and we are, at last, warm enough to sleep.
The renaissance of heat and the death of the draft. We've made it through the mud and dung insulation of the peasant huts and the smoky, high-stakes luxury of the medieval castle. But as we drift into the late 1400s and early 1500s, the era of the Renaissance, the world started to get a little bit more comfortable, though in the most complicated way possible. Because, as we've learned, humans never choose the simple solution when a dramatic, expensive one is available. This was the era of the Great Rebuilding. Suddenly, having one giant fire in the middle of a hall wasn't enough. People wanted privacy, which meant they wanted separate rooms. And if you have separate rooms, you need separate heat. This led to the architectural nightmare of the stacked chimney. Imagine a castle wall that is essentially more hollow flue than actual stone. Builders were carving tunnels through the heart of the building, like giant vertical termite mounds, just so the duke's daughter could have a slightly less freezing bedroom. Of course, these early chimneys were terrifying. They were often lined with wood and plaster, because why not build a fire delivery system out of flammable materials? And they were prone to chimney fires. This gave birth to a whole new class of servants whose entire existence was dedicated to climbing into small, soot-filled holes to scrape out the creosote. It was a dirty, dangerous, and utterly unglamorous way to keep the elite from shivering. But let's float over to the fashion of the 16th century, because this is where the keep warm strategy met peak ego. You've seen the portraits of Henry VIII, right? He's basically shaped like a giant velvet square. That wasn't just because he liked cake. Those massive padded shoulders and heavy doublets were stuffed with bombast, extra padding made of wool, rags, or even sawdust. It was essentially wearable upholstery. Henry wasn't just a king, he was a walking sofa. It kept the heat in, but it also meant that if you tripped, you'd probably just roll around like a turtle until a squire flipped you back over. And then there's the curious case of the zibellino, or the flea fur. This is one of those historical details that makes you want to wash your hands just thinking about it. Noble women would carry the preserved skin of a marten or a sable, often with the head and paws decorated in gold and jewels. They would drape it over their shoulders or hang it from their belts. The idea, and I use that term loosely, was that fleas would be more attracted to the warm, fuzzy animal skin than to the actual human being. It was a biological decoy. It kept your neck warm and theoretically kept the biting insects occupied. Because nothing says, "I'm wealthy," like a jewel-encrusted dead weasel designed to act as a flea magnet. As we move into the 1600s, we see the rise of the tiled stove in Northern Europe. These were massive floor-to-ceiling ceramic towers. You'd build a small fire inside, and the ceramic tiles would soak up the heat and radiate it out slowly for hours. They were beautiful, covered in blue and white paintings of saints or landscapes. They were the first step toward actual civilized heating. You could lean your back against the warm tiles and feel a deep, penetrating heat that didn't involve breathing in a lungful of oak smoke. It was a revolution in comfort, provided you were rich enough to own a giant ceramic tower. But even with these advancements, the winter was still the enemy. In the 1680s, during the peak of the Little Ice Age, it was so cold in the Palace of Versailles that the wine supposedly froze in the king's glass. Imagine being Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful man in Europe, and your wine is a popsicle. It's a humbling reminder that nature doesn't care about your divine right when the temperature hits zero. Let's take one last look around our historical bedroom.
The tapestries are still there, the box bed is shut tight, the hot brick is cooling down at the foot of the mattress, and the zibolino is waiting on the chair to catch tomorrow's fleas. The air is still cold, but it's a quiet, familiar cold. It's the sound of a world that is slow, dark, and deeply tucked in. We've traveled from the central hearth to the tiled stove, through layers of wool and piles of dogs. We've survived the smoke, the drafts, and the frozen rivers. And now, as the last of the embers glow in our mind's eye, it's time to let the history fade away. You are in the present. You are warm. The thermostat is set, the blankets are heavy, and the stone walls are all in the past. Sweet dreams of warm fires and velvet doublets. The curfew bell has rung. It's time to cover the fire and rest.
The Bedpan Chronicles and the Invention of the Cozy. We've made it through the grand palaces and the mud-caked cottages, but as we drift deeper into the night, let's talk about the absolute peak of human ingenuity when it comes to the most vulnerable place in a castle, the bed. Because, as it turns out, the Renaissance wasn't just about art and science. It was about the desperate, frantic search for a warm mattress. If you lived in the year 1620, the moment you stepped out of your clothes and into your bed was the most dangerous part of your day. You were leaving the relative safety of your fur-lined doublet for a sheet that felt like a sheet of ice. This is where the bed wagon comes in. This was a massive wooden frame shaped like a cage that you would slide under the covers. Inside the cage sat a pot of glowing coals. It was basically a giant toaster for your legs. If the wood didn't catch fire, you had a wonderfully warm bed. If it did, well, you were at least the brightest thing in the village for a few minutes. Let's float over to the stone pig. No, not a literal farm animal, but a ceramic hot water bottle shaped like a flattened oval. They called them pigs because they were stout and stayed warm for a long time. You'd boil a kettle, taking about 40 minutes on a temperamental hearth, fill the pig, and shove it to the bottom of the bed. It was a game of foot tag. You wanted your toes near the heat, but if you touched the bare ceramic, you'd get a brand that lasted until Easter. Because why have comfort without a little bit of physical peril? And then there's the clothing of the night. Today we have soft flannel pajamas. In the 17th century, they had the night rail. This was a heavy, hooded cape you wore in bed. And yes, you wore a nightcap. These weren't just for fashion, they were essential for heat retention. Since your head was the only part of you sticking out of the fabric survival pod of your bed curtains, you had to wrap it in layers of linen and wool. A man without a nightcap in a 1650s winter was a man who was asking for a permanent sinus headache. It gave everyone the silhouette of a very tired, very grumpy garden gnome. Let's glide over to the windows. Glass was incredibly expensive, and more importantly, it was thin. To combat the howling gale effect, people would use internal shutters. You'd close the glass, then close the heavy wooden shutters inside, and then pull a velvet curtain over the whole thing. It was like living in a nested doll of window treatments. You couldn't see anything, and the room was pitch black by 4:30 p.m., but you were marginally less likely to freeze to death while reading by candlelight. Speaking of candles, let's talk about tallow. If you weren't a duke, you weren't burning beeswax, you were burning rendered animal fat. It gave off a dim, flickering yellow light and smelled exactly like a frying pan full of old beef. So your room was cold, dark, and smelled like a kitchen, even when it wasn't. It's a miracle anyone managed to write poetry or discover gravity under these conditions. They were probably too distracted by the smell of their own lighting fixtures. As we reach the tail end of our journey, imagine the great hall of a decaying castle. The fires are out. The dogs are huddling together in the rushes.
The only warmth left is the residual heat in the stone chimney and the breath of the few servants sleeping near the embers. It's a quiet, heavy cold, a cold that makes the world feel very small and very still. But you're not there. You're here. You have a mattress that hasn't been warmed by a cage of coals. You have air that doesn't smell like burnt fat. You have the luxury of a world that has finally, after thousands of years of shivering, figured out how to keep the light on and the frost out. The story of the cold is over for tonight. The drafts have been sealed. The tapestries are just decorations now. You can let go of the stone pigs and the zibellinos. The night is soft, the room is steady, and you are perfectly, wonderfully warm.